Well, thanks so much for coming out this morning to learn about the amazing stuff that's going on here in the 14-mile watershed. I'm Tracy Hames, Executive Director with Wisconsin Wetlands Association. We're a statewide nonprofit that literally works to help landowners and communities understand how wetlands can be solutions to the issues that you all are having in your neighborhoods and in your watersheds. My talk will start with this. I don't know what page it is, but it says Wetlands as Solutions. I'll talk a little bit about how wetlands can play into the work that's going on here in the watershed and why they're important and what they are, etc. So because we're outdoors, usually we have a slideshow. These are our slides today. I want to start out by saying, you know, when Don Eastad called me up and said, hey, do I want to give a quick presentation here? I said, of course I will, because I'm so excited about the work that's happening right now in this watershed and what's beginning. So hopefully a lot of you folks will be involved and are involved, and we'll learn a little bit about what can be done, because all these problems that you're experiencing are solvable, but it takes folks working together to do that. So here we go. I'll talk loud. I always want to start out by talking about what wetlands are. Thanks, Scott, for taking the time up to the reins. A lot of folks, when they think about what wetlands are, you think about a big open water area with cattails around the fringe of it, and a lot of ducks or herons or things like that standing out in the water. And that is a type of wetland, you know, a deep water marsh. But there's a lot of different types of wetlands that we have in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is an incredibly wetland-rich state and a very diverse state. Many, many different types of wetlands. So when you want to think about what wetlands are, wetlands in a nutshell, the Hames definition is wetlands are those places in between the areas that are always dry and the areas that are always wet. So it's the in-between zone, right? So some wetlands are really close to the always dry end. So people would look at some of those wetlands and not even recognize them as wetlands. And there's other wetlands that are closer to the always wet. But the important thing with wetlands is the water's always changing. The water will rise and lower different times of the year, or maybe over a period of years. The important thing to remember with wetlands is not only are they in the in-between zone, but they're always changing. And the health of those wetlands is dependent on the changes in how the water behaves, the rise and fall of the water. So when wetlands dry up, sometimes that's not a bad thing. Oftentimes that's a good thing, because the vegetation and things in that wetland are adapted to being wet sometimes and being drier on other times. So if we always had them always wet, then guess what? That's a lake, right? So think about wetlands that way. Go to the next page here. What good are wetlands? Why should we care about wetlands? Well, for a lot of reasons, and I'll just go over a couple here very quickly. Wetlands are the great managers of our waters that flow across our landscape. Wetlands are really the regulators. They're the governors, if you can think of it that way. So when water comes, when the snow melt comes, when the rains come, in a healthy area, a lot of that water will go into wetlands, and wetlands will hold on to that water and either slowly release it downstream or allow it to soak into the ground. So when you remove wetlands, you lose the capacity of the landscape to help manage water. So what happens then? Rains come, snowmelt comes, the water gets on the land, and it rushes off into our rivers, into our lakes, without that holding capacity that the wetlands provide. And when the water runs off the land, what's it doing? It's bringing all the gunk that it's taking off the landscape as well. The water that should be infiltrating into our groundwater is not, because it's being rushed down, especially in the spring. Everybody sees, you know, when the spring comes, our waters are going through this watershed into the Wisconsin River all the way down to New Orleans, right? That's water we want to be holding on to and soaking into the ground. Wetland loss contributes to that. So part of the solution is getting wetlands back on the ground. The other thing that Scott talked a lot about is wetlands and water quality. So, as you know, we've got some important water quality issues here in the Tri-Lakes area. And how do we fix that, right? There's a lot of different ways to fix it. And wetlands are an important part of the solutions to cleaning the lakes here. Look at this picture here where it says they improve water quality, meaning wetlands. The picture on the left is runoff from a farm field that doesn't have, that had lost its wetlands. See all the gunk and sediment that's coming off of that. By the way, these two pictures were taken at the same location on one side of the road to the other. And on the other side, the same time, here's some runoff that's going through a wetland, coming off an ag field, running through a wetland. If you're confused, it's this page here that says they improve water quality on the bottom. That's nice, clean, clear water going off into the creek in this situation because it's being filtered through that wetland. So wetlands in the right locations can do wonders, and especially like Scott was saying, the nitrates. Wetlands are really, really good at processing nitrates. The plants and the bacteria and all the stuff that's in the soil eats that stuff up, takes it out of the system. I give a lot of talks, especially up north, where we have a lot of healthy wetlands yet. And I talk to people and say, okay, we've got, 10,000 acres of lakes in this county. How many acres of wetlands do you think we have? Most people think, well, 10%, 15, 20% of the acres of lakes. No. In the places where we have healthy lakes in Wisconsin, we have 4 to 5 times more wetland acreage than we do lake acreage. And those wetlands are the filters. Those are the things keeping our lakes clean in those areas. So when we remove those wetlands, we remove the capacity of our land, help provide clean water into our lakes. What happens then when you remove wetlands, not only can you not process the nitrates, but the water flushes off fast, right? That increases the energy of the water. When you have runoff happening swiftly, that's picking up sediment, that's causing erosion. And all that dirt that was up here on the landscape then goes with the water. And which way does water flow? Downhill, right? What's at the bottom of the hill? The lakes. All that junk that used to be up there now goes into our lakes, and it goes with increased energy because the runoff comes all at once. When we remove our wetlands, we get flashier runoff events. The water rises fast and drops quickly because there's nothing holding on to it. So getting that back and using those are important parts. And in the 14-mile watershed, what have we got right in the middle of it? If you look at this map here, and at I think the first page on your handout is a map of the watershed. And a watershed is an area where all the water flows together to a common area. So the whole area around this orange line, within the orange line, is flowing right into the lakes here from upstream. And what do we got right in the middle of this watershed? A thing called the Laola Marsh. So historically, the Laola Marsh was this gigantic wetland that was not only capturing the runoff from above, but it was filtering all the gunk and everything that was in it. And 100 plus years ago, what did we do? We wanted to farm every acre of land, so we ditched the Laola Marsh. The extensive amount of ditches now running through the area that used to be a really big, very large watershed right in the middle, wetland, right in the middle of your watershed. So ditching that then removes all the values, all the benefits that you would get from that wetland. So the really interesting project that Scott was talking about on some DNR land right now is an experiment filling in some of those ditches. Remember when we ditched Laola Marsh years and years ago, we tried to farm that whole area. And they found out very quickly that that was a fool's task. And a lot of it was not very good cropland. It was hard to drain, it was still very wet. But once they ditched it, then it dried up all those organic soil layers. And when you have a big wetland like the Laola Marsh, there's a lot of built up carbon and organic material in the soil. When you dry that up, not only does the carbon go back into the air, wetlands are really great at sequestering carbon, by the way. So if we're putting too much carbon in the air, we need more wetlands pulling it back down. But when you drain a wetland, all the carbon from thousands of years of organic development goes back up into the air. We dried up the Laola Marsh. All that organic material then, because it was dry, burned. And the whole place burned 100 years ago. It was really hard to farm. soils were damaged, et cetera, and this whole idea of really productive farmland was not realized because of that. So now we've got a lot of grazing, we've got a lot of things going on, very beneficial in the Laola Marsh, but are there opportunities now? Do we need that level of drainage in that marsh, you know, to maintain healthy agriculture? Maybe in some portions of that marsh, the answer is no. So the work that's going on with Scott and the DNR right now, we're doing an experiment, filling in some of those ditches that are on DNR land. And if you're DNR, you're managing it for wildlife, right? Well, why wouldn't you want then to bring the marsh back? So they're filling in that ditch with the idea that the groundwater levels will rise up in that location. Because what ditches do, the reason we dig ditches in ag land is to drop the water level. They pull groundwater out and put it into the drain and send it downstream. So by filling that ditch, you're raising the groundwater back up. Getting that water then interacting with the wetland soils, that's the stuff that really helps then process those nitrates, anything that's in your groundwater, in the gunk, that eventually is going to end up in these lakes. So let's try and treat some of this stuff before it ever even gets to our lakes here. That's the idea behind the Laola Marsh work that DNR is involved in. And I'll tell you, I'm so excited about this project. Not only is it a really good experiment for this watershed, but it's something that we probably will be able to use throughout the whole region if we can show that it works effectively. Because remember, 100 years ago, we had different agriculture back then. We dug a lot of ditches, maybe in places that today, in modern situations, don't need the level of drainage that we have. So where are the places where we can get that back and raise those water levels up in these places, help water? So really exciting stuff happening right here in your backyard, and I can't wait to see it implemented and see what happens. Go to the next page. Historically, Wisconsin was a very wetland-rich state. Wisconsin had somewhere between 25 and 35% of its whole landscape was wetlands historically. That's a wet foot, a wet step every 3 to 4 steps. That's a lot of wetlands. We were a soaking wet state. We've lost half the wetland in Wisconsin through development over the last literally 150 years. You can't remove that amount of wetlands without some serious implications to the water resources in other areas. And the wetland loss is not spread out evenly. Up north, we still have a lot of our wetlands, pretty good places up there. Most of our wetland loss occurred from about Highway 29 south, with a few exceptions. So down in areas like this, it was a lot more than 50% of the wetlands were lost. We've really changed the way water flows across our landscape because of that wetland loss. So the big challenge is how do we bring that back? The wetlands that we have left are in pretty tough shape also because wetlands are tied in with the natural flow of the water in the watershed. Change that water flow. Remember, the wetlands are in between, always dry and always wet. That alters the wetlands themselves, so they have less of a capacity to help manage the water and do the things that we want them to do. So what happens then, a lot of our development, a lot of the wetlands that we removed historically were in the places where it was easiest to remove them, right? And that's in the upper portions of the watershed. So we do some tiling, do some ditches, it's easy to drain those wetlands. Down lower in the watershed, it's harder. What we've done is moved the water that used to be held in the upper portions of our watershed, flushed it downstream into the lower portion. Some of you drive Highway 13 frequently, I imagine, up and down here, and you've seen how wet it's been the last several years, right? Maybe that's some of that water should have been held upstream, upper in the watershed. Instead, it was flushed down. We've made our upper watersheds in a lot of places drier, and we've made our lower areas wetter. So can we get that balance back out? And getting wetlands back helps bring that balance back. So some of our areas are wetter, and then you'll see in the picture here, some are drying up. There's a famous creek, river not too far from here, Little Plover River. I'll talk about that in a second. That's dried up a few times. This is not the Little Plover River, this picture. This is Duck Creek, I think in 2015. A lot of folks didn't even know that one dried up that summer. Next page here, you'll see some places are getting wetter, and this is some of the areas like down along Highway 13. A lot of our farm fields, when we remove the wetlands upstream, some of our farmlands, some of our neighborhoods, we're getting water in places where we've never seen water before. And we can say, well, that was a historic rain event. Well, maybe so, but we've lost also the capacity of our landscape to handle that water and reduce those floods. Get the wetlands back, smooth the curve out of the floods. It's just like, when we talked about the virus, everybody wants to flatten the curve. Same thing with water, with runoff. When you lose your wetlands, you have a real sharp curve. The water flows off all at once, and the floods get really high, and then they drop fast. Because you're pouring all your bucket of water out at once, moving all your water through at once. If you have wetlands slowing that down, then the water will rise on these rain events, but not as high, not nearly as high, and it'll drop. So it's a much smoother curve. We're not flooding places then that we don't want flooded. So wetlands are an important part of that. So how do we turn this around? What do we do? Not only in the 14-mile watershed, but throughout Wisconsin to help heal the way water is moving through our watershed. And for us, obviously I work for a wetlands association. One of the big answers to that is getting wetlands back on the landscape. Next page here where it says watershed landscape approach. To do this, we have to be looking at a landscape approach. Remember, we've lost half our wetlands, even more of that in places like this. So we're not going to get all our wetlands back. It wouldn't even be appropriate in a modern landscape, right? We need farms, we need roads, we need cities, we need these places that used to be wetlands. Of course we do. So how then do we think about getting the right amounts of the right types of wetlands back in the right locations to help address the issues that we're dealing with here? So it doesn't mean every wetland back, but being smart about it. And when you look around the watersheds like this, you find all kinds of opportunities where wetland restoration, bringing wetlands back, not only would not hurt agriculture or the roads or the cities, but also might help economically in some of our areas. So working with folks to find where those places are to get the right amounts back. So it's really exciting when you take that view, because then you're not, it's not pie in the sky, it's doable. So the next one here with the yellow-headed blackbird picture here, how do we get wetlands back on the landscape, right? There's a couple of real important points here. Our organization, we work with communities to help them understand how wetlands can be solutions. What that means is we work just like the 14-mile watershed is doing and say, what are the issues here? And early on, with all the water testing and working with the landowners along the lakes, all these folks came together and said, here's what our problem is. We agree that this is a problem. These are the struggles that we're having. So then organizations like us can come in and say, all right, great. You've identified your problem. How can wetlands be a part of the solution to those problems that you've identified? So in other words, we're not just going out and saying, hey, you guys need wetlands back. Well, why do we need wetlands? It's, hey, let us help you implement wetlands as part of the solution to what you're trying to accomplish. So we're happy to be working with the 14-mile folks on this. The plan they've got in place and everything else, the future, I think, looks really bright here. The other really interesting fact is the second little bullet on that slide that says why we need to work with landowners. 75% of the remaining wetlands in Wisconsin are on private land, right? So when we think of wetlands, we think of Laola Marsh, we think of, Big Rocha Cree Park, we think of these places that have a lot of wetlands that are in public ownership. That's only 25% of our wetlands in the state. It's all on private land, 75% of it. So if we're not working with private landowners, helping them understand how wetlands can not only help the watershed, but also help the water management on their properties, that's how we need to move forward. If we're going to get the quantity of wetlands back in the right locations to solve our issues here. Another fact I didn't put on here, but of the wetlands that we've lost that could be brought back, 85% of those are on private land. So if we're going to get wetlands back as solutions in this watershed and across the state, we have to be working with private landowners. So once again, go to the last page here with a picture of that little marsh. It's all about viewing wetlands as solutions to the problems we're having. And in the past, so many people looked at wetlands as problems. Oh, I've got something here I want to do with my land, but the wetland's in the way and it's causing me problems. I want to develop this or that. And that's been the attitude. So instead, how can we work with realtors, agriculture, all different industries to understand then how wetlands on the landscape can actually be a benefit to the things that they're doing. And it's really exciting because the tide is starting to turn now and people are starting to be receptive now to wetlands. And one of the reasons people are really starting to look is because we've had, just not as bad as here, but we've had these really big intense rain events coming in where a storm will come in usually about 8 o'clock at night and stop in one location and dump a foot of rain all at once and then move on out. That's been happening all over the state in the last several years. Climate change probably is part of it, who knows, but the reality is it's happening. So people are having problems now with runoff and they're really receptive now to wetland solutions. We're working a lot up in Ashland area now where it's a very steep landscape, and literally one rain event a few years ago caused $35 million in public infrastructure damage. One rain event in one night, and 2 people lost their lives. That's, people take notice of that. When you look at where the problems occurred in those watersheds and where the wetland loss occurred, they line up almost perfectly. So we're not saying wetland loss is the only thing, but wetland loss contributed a lot to what happened and where the damage occurred and where it didn't occur. So same thing here. In places like this, much flatter watershed than those areas. Wetlands also are important solutions to the landscape. And we always say wetlands aren't the only things we need to do to fix the water here, but we can't fix the water without wetlands. So a critical component. We've been involved now with the folks here for about a year, and hopefully we'll be increasing our involvement in the 14-mile watershed over the next several years. We've been working a lot nearby here in a place called Little Plover River, and a lot of you folks are familiar with that. It very infamously dried up a few years ago, a lot of groundwater issues and things like that. We've been working a lot, and there's Dan Bauman in the back. Hi, Dan. He's been a big partner in Little Plover River work, DNR has, looking at how wetlands can be a part of the solutions in that area as well. In the past, we were looking at 1 or 2 different types of stresses on the environment that may have been contributing greatly to some of our problems, but we ignored the wetlands. We didn't really think about how water was moving across the land. So filling some ditches there, bringing back some wetlands, reconnecting floodplains, all this stuff now is contributing to helping in that watershed bring back a more natural hydrology, more natural systems, and allow the watershed to be more resilient to the problems we're having right now. In other words, we'll still have droughts, we'll still have these big rain events, but how can we keep our watersheds not unravel and go out of whack every time one of these things happen? Bringing in resilience, helping our land handle these changes that are occurring is what's important. Wetlands are a big part of that. There's a link here if you want to see a video about some of the work that's going on in Little Plover River. It's the same model that 14-mile watershed is using right now. It's bringing the community together, identifying the problems, and working together, shoulder to shoulder, neighbor to neighbor, to, by God, fix these problems together without pointing fingers and saying, what can we do? How can we work together to solve these things? Good things are happening there. Good things are happening here. And we're so excited to be a part of this. And thank you all for coming to also be a part of finding these solutions. I'll be around, of course, afterwards, as Scott is and others, to ask or answer questions. I've got information up here about our organization, so thanks so much.